and unsurprisingly, the wolves begin to panic.
Hello everybody, I hope you're doing well. There's a bit of a narrative skip between this and the last episode. If you want to find out what happened and delve into the mind of Moxis the Reanimator, you can check out the short story in the description linked below, or just enjoy the video for what it is. Anyway, on with the episode.
The Grim Pinnacle. If I'm quick, I can get there before the dwarves take note. I'll take the vanguard ahead and move with haste on the laboratory. The bulk of my minions will be just behind, should I have need of them.
Looks like a large group of the dead moving toward the ford. Aye, that biscuit a bird back to Stoney Creek. And West Slope, they'll be able to get here a bit quicker. More Golden Rock? Ah, Scout. Murdered in Golden Rock. What's all this fuss about then? The vanguard of the undead have crossed the ford and broken away from the main force. They number a little more than your own, and they're making their way in this direction. Right, well, let's show those bastards these are dwarf lands. You've obviously looked around. Any suggestions on where to draw our line? Ah, Lord, there's a narrow clearing in the woods ahead. We can funnel their forces, and the woods will slow any flankers. Excellent. Let's show this new king of Storm Peak the middle of West Slope dwarves.
The spearhead forces of Moxis the Reanimator are led by Moxis himself, a level 3 necromancer with the spells Fireball, Reanimate and Revive. With him is Gangrenous Hex, a level 1 necromancer with Reanimate. Autocratics, a level 1 necromancer with Poison Blades. The Revenant Champion Rigamortix leads the Worm Hewers, 19 Revenant Linebreakers. The Wickerwood Champion leads the Wickerwood Soldiers, 19 Skeleton Soldiers. We have the Wormreach Spears, 20 Spear Skeletons. The Crimson Stalkers, 10 Ghouls. And the Darkmoor and Shadowpelt Wolves, 2 units of 5 wolves each. The Delaying force of dwarves are led by Murderden Goldenrock, a dwarf captain with a bodyguard of 14 dwarf soldiers, the West Slope Guard. He's joined by Bronra the Crone, a level 2 dwarf spellcaster with the spells Fireball and Stoneheart. We have the West Slope Responders, 15 dwarf soldiers, the West Slope Spears, 20 spear dwarves, the West Slope Archers, 10 dwarf archers, the Stoney Creek Watch, 10 dwarf border guard, and the West Slope Militia, 15 dwarf militia. Today's game will be a breakthrough scenario. The forward elements of Moxis' army have crossed Stoney Creek and need to break through the dwarves' line, while the dwarves want to delay the advance of the undead forces, giving the king time to muster. This will be an 8-turn game. If the undead forces can get 2 units, at least 5 models strong, within 12 inches of the dwarf's table edge, they will be victorious. If the dwarves can prevent this, they will achieve victory. So let's get this underway. Initiative for turn 1, blue dice for the dwarves and black for the undead. The dwarves will take the initiative with an 8. Bronra the Crone begins by casting Stoneheart on the West Slope Guard. The excitement of the situation distracts her, however, and the spell fizzles. Both forces march towards each other, the dwarves striking weapon to shield, voices raised in jeering insult. The uncaring ranks of Moxis silent beyond their clacking movement. Moxis prowls along the rear of his line, slinging a fireball to detonate among the West Slope responders. A single dwarf falls to the fiery explosion, but the rest march on unperturbed. The craftsmen and labourers of the West Slope Militia become anxious at the sight of the magic and fail to activate. and their unease rubs off on the archers, who advance only reluctantly. Their officer forces them to reach the stability of the top of the hill, but it will cost them on their next turn. The Darkmoor wolves lope forward, followed quickly by the Crimson Stalkers. The Stoney Creek watch advance, but stick to the cover of the trees, waiting for their opportunity to strike. The Shadow-Pelt wolves move into the woods on the right flank. Gangrenous Hex advances, his spellcraft unneeded for now. And Autocratics enchants the Wormhewer's weapons with the spell Poison Blades. Turn 1 ends with the undead forces advancing relentlessly. Their dwarven left is a little reluctant to advance, but their centre presents a solid wall to the undead.
Yes, my minions, drive them from the field.
Initiative on turn 2 goes to nobody initially, but the undead take it on the reroll. The Wormreach spears advance quickly, puppeted by Moxis' will. Ronra the Crone activates and, her mind back in the game, successfully casts Stoneheart on the West Slope Guard, their skins taken on a grey, stone-like hue as their defence raises to a mighty 11. The Wickerwood soldiers cautiously march forward. Unlike the Wormreach spears, they halt in a position the dwarves cannot reach. The West Slope archers activate successfully and loose a volley at the Wormreach spears.
I'm knackered now.
The extra push to advance to the top of the hill last turn means their volley is a little ragged now, but shoot 2 and defence 9 results in 2 hits, enough to drop a single skeleton with the undead rule. This is the moment Gangrenous Hex has been waiting for, and intoning words of power, he knits the fallen skeleton back together and it rises back into place, filling that 4th rank, as Gangrenous shuffles sideways. As the volley of arrow passes in front of them, the West Slope responders charge forward into the waiting ranks of spear skeletons.
Axes out, lads.
With fight 2 plus 1 from a rank, the dwarves smash into the brittle skeleton lines, felling 3 of the abominations. The ranks of skeletons are deep, and though the magic binding them is drained from their advance, they strike at the dwarves with fight 3 on defence 10, spitting a single dwarf through his mail shirt. With a -2 morale modifier, a further skeleton is crumpled by the dwarves' advance, and the victorious dwarves drive the undead back, in good spirits.
That's it, off you go.
The Shadowpelt wolves, skittish at the best of times, are frightened by the sounds of combat and the dwarven jeering, and creep forward slowly through the woods. Girding themselves, the West Slope militia march forward and wheel, determined to uphold their honour. Moxis advances and bolsters the crumbling Wormreach ranks. Finding the weave and casting Reanimate, he restores 1 skeleton to unlife. The Stoney Creek watch activate and loose a volley at the Wickerwood soldiers, the only target they can see. Requiring 6s, only a single arrow strikes true, and the skeletons are unaffected by the rain of shafts. The watch then wheel backwards, weary of the sounds coming from the other side of the woods before them. Autocratics activates once more and calls forth his deadly enchantment on the blades of the Wickerwood soldiers, but the magic slips from his grasp. Muradin Goldenrock calls on his guard and the spear dwarves next to him to advance, activating both units with the command rule. The West Slope spears advance and wheel to guard the dwarf right flank, while Muradin and the West Slope guard advance up the centre, holding back a little so they don't get hit by the Revenant linebreakers. Speaking of which, the Wormhewers activate and advance, exposing their flank to the West Slope responders. The Darkmoor wolves fail to activate and slink forward on the left, while the Crimson Stalkers cautiously advance into the woods. Turn 2 ends with both sides preparing to charge, the dwarves having got the better of the initial engagement.
All right, beards, they're not to pass this point.
The all-important initiative on turn 3 goes to the dwarves with an 8. Muradin Goldenrock takes the lead, activating his West Slope Guard and commanding the West Slope responders to charge with him. The West Slope responders eagerly wheel and slam into the flank of the Wormhewers.
Kill the bastards!
Axes and hammers rise and fall, breaking through undead guards and battering 2 revenants to the ground. The revenants on the flank strike back, Rigor Mortix, the champion, leading the counterattack. His mighty club shatters limbs and sends 2 dwarves sprawling to the ground, while the axes of his bodyguard fell another. A further dwarf sinks to the ground, fire within his veins, as the slightest scratch from the revenant's poisoned blades is deadly. Despite the unexpected fury of the revenant's defence, the dwarves remain in good order as the revenants rebuff their attack.
We'll get them next time.
Muradin Goldenrock follows the responders' charge by pivoting and hitting the revenants in the front.
Hit them now!
Capitalising on the distraction to the revenant's flank, Muradin and his guards strike hard, cutting low, shields held high before them. 3 revenants are kneecapped by the furious dwarves, desiccated limbs crumpling under heavy blows. Unprepared for the dual assault, their binding weakening, the revenants' axes are turned by shield or hardened skin, and only a single dwarf falls. Another revenant goes down due to their uncaring nature, and the dwarves force the remainders back in high spirits. The fury of their assault momentarily forces the Wickerwood soldiers to retreat as well, maintaining an inch between enemy units. The Wickerwood soldiers quickly turn the tables, the Wickerwood champion leading the way. They wheel and hit the flank of the West Slope Guard. Skeletal limbs thrust ancient bronze swords, and 2 find weak points in the dwarves' defences. The champion himself is foiled by magically hardened skin. The dwarves on the flank hit back, but wearied by the skirmish with the revenants, their blows are deflected by broad bronze shields. Maintaining good order, the dwarves are forced to regroup 6 inches away, pushing the whole line to their left. The West Slope spears find themselves in an opportune position. Wheeling, they make for the rear of the Wickerwood soldiers, in a somewhat dodgy manoeuvre.
Get a hurry on, spears. They're right where we want them.
The Wickerwood champion makes his way to the rear of the unit to fight alone. The dwarves burst from the bush, spears driven before them, and smash into the skeletons with a mighty fight of 6. 4 skeleton soldiers are shattered by the charge. The Wickerwood champion counters, but drained and fighting to the rear, he's hemmed in by spear and shield and unable to make use of his imposing bronze sword. The momentum of the dwarves' charge tramples a further skeleton soldier, and the rest of the unit is driven forward. The battle lines continue to flow to the dwarves' left. The Shadowpelt wolves gather their courage at the scent of blood, pivoting and lunging at the West Slope responders' rear. Absolute chaos. It doesn't get much better for wolves. Charging into the rear gives them a fight of 3, but they're not prepared for the heavy armour of the dwarves, and slavering jaws slide off helm and shield or fail to puncture mail. Hemmed in on all sides, the dwarves fight back feebly, 1 dice at fight 0, failing to wound any of the wolves, before both sides back up. Miserable. The border guards spot the approaching Darkmoor wolves through the trees and loose a volley in their direction. The woods provide the wolves with some protection, but the keen-eyed archers still manage to hit 2 of the beasts. And unsurprisingly, the wolves begin to panic. Autocratix eyes the ghouls on the spear dwarf's flank, but immediately fails to activate. Bronra the Crone also fails to activate. There must be something tampering with a magical weave. The Wormreach spears activate. They march to their right before charging into the flank of the rather harried West Slope responders. They must be feeling Moxis' eye upon them, because they strike the dwarves' line like a hammer, spears parting mail like cloth as 3 dwarves fall before their advance. Exhausted from the constant combat, the dwarves' counterattack is foiled by bronze helm and shield. The West Slope responders continue to hold firm, yet the momentum of the skeletal offensive pushes them back. The Westslope archers spot the Shadowpelt wolves in the woods and loose a shower of arrows that plunge through the canopy, striking 2 of the wolves. And unsurprisingly, the wolves begin to panic. The Crimson Stalkers activate and do the Undead shuffle. In another somewhat dodgy manoeuvre, they swing around and hit the rear of the Westslope spears. Fair's fair, I guess.
They're behind us!
Rusting knives and filthy claws fall upon the dwarves from behind, gnashing teeth snapping at exposed flesh, dragging 4 unlucky dwarves to the ground, screaming. The dwarves fight back. Tired from the previous fight and assailed from the rear, they fail to finish any of the undead creatures. The wild charge of the ghouls overwhelm another hapless dwarf, but the remaining dwarves cannot exploit the reckless attack. The dwarves' courage begins to fail them as they stumble out of the woods.
It had to be trees.
The Westslope militia, bewildered by the chaos before them, stand around in confusion for a moment, before wheeling to face the hole growing in the dwarven lines. The Darkmoor wolves successfully rally. Go them! They prowl along the edges of the woods, approaching the Stoney Creek watch, but hugging the scant cover of the trees. Gangrenous Hex moves to his left to draw a line of sight to the Wickerwood soldiers, and then successfully reanimates one of the fallen skeletons. Moxis spots the wavering spear dwarves and recites the words of power for a fireball spell. The spell detonates among the dwarves, but their armour and shields prevent the worst of the blast, and they escape little more than singed eyebrows and beards. The end of turn 3 sees the lines in all kinds of a mess. Units are getting hammered on all sides and casualties are piling up, though the dwarves do seem to be taking the worst of it. They'll need the support of their militia and their archers if they're to hold the line.
Steady, lads. Hold them here. Death embraces all.
The dwarves take the initiative again on turn 4. Incensed by the insult of their smouldering beards, the Westslope spear's courage rekindles in a furious rage. Unable to charge the skeletons before them, they about face to drive the ghouls from the woods. The Wickerwood champion seeks to cut the head from the snake, and shuffling his soldiers sideways to clear the worm hewers, he charges the flank of the bellowing dwarf's unit.
Hold them here.
Prepared for the dwarf's stone-hard skin, the champion strikes with his heavy pommel, fracturing skulls as his fellows batter the dwarves into submission. 5 fall before the Wickerwood soldiers. The dwarves only claim a single skeleton in return. The skeletons regroup after their fruitful charge, and the dwarves remain stoic despite the beating they received.
Is that all you got?
The Westslope archers send another volley through the trees at the Shadowpelt pack. Arrows lance through foliage and another 2 wolves drop, yelping in fright and pain. This is all a bit much for the last remaining wolf, and he bolts, tail tucked between his legs. The worm-reached spears shuffle sideways to avoid the worm hewers, before slamming once more into the flank of the Westslope responders.
Here they come again.
His spear thrusts down 2 more dwarves, and a return axe blow shatters an ancient spine.
Take that.
The dwarves are driven back under the weight of the skeletal charge, but their resolve remains unyielding. The Stoney Creek watch dismiss the wolves in front of them as no real threat, and loose a volley at the Crimson Stalkers using the aimed fire rule. With the cover of the woods and their undead nature, the single hit on the ghouls is ignored, and the watch wheel back to give themselves both space and a greater choice of potential targets. Moxis the Reanimator attempts to shore up the undead lines by casting Revive on the worm hewers. As he mutters the arcane rites, the weave fluctuates, and Moxis finds himself momentarily becalmed.
Curse it.
Bronra the Crone is also taken back by the shifting spell weave and fails to activate. The worm hewers pivot and and slam into the front of the already pressed West Slope guard. Muradin orders his dwarves to brace, and they raise their shields in defence, reducing the revenants down to 4 dice. Even so, 3 of the dwarves fall to the heavy impacts of bronze axes. Too focused on fending off the revenants' blows, the dwarves fail to strike any down in return. Muradin Goldenrock's encouragement holds the dwarves steady as they regroup 6 inches away from the worm pewers. The West Slope militia, encouraged by the proximity of Muradin Goldenrock, rush forward towards the fray. With a 7.5-inch double move, they are short of the Wickerwood soldiers and forced to stop an inch away, ready to complete their charge next turn. The magical weave seems to be concentrating around Gangrenous Hex. Cast and reanimate on the Wickerwood soldiers results in 2 being rebound with magical sinews to rejoin the ranks. Autocratics fails to activate, also caught in the space between strands. But indifferent to the shifting of magic, the Darkmoor walls successfully activate. They rush across the clearing towards the Stoney Creek Watch. Slowed by the woods, they cannot reach their chosen prey. They choose instead to wheel and hem the dwarves in. The Crimson Stalkers are the final undead unit to activate, albeit unsuccessfully. Already unwilling to charge into the waiting spears of the West Slope dwarves, they back up through the woods where the dwarves cannot reach them. But with the nimble rule, they can still threaten the dwarves if an opportunity presents itself. At the end of turn 4, the dwarves are taking a hammering. Their soldier units are being soundly trounced. But they continue to hold the line, and as long as they can keep holding their ground, they can still pull out a victory.
Loose when ready.
Initiative on turn 5 goes to the Undead with a 9-7. The Wickerwood soldiers seems like a good place to start, but with a 1 they fail to activate. Perhaps this is where it all starts to fall apart for Moxis. Their simple magical intelligence overwhelmed by options, the Wickerwood soldiers wheel backwards and pause, frozen with indecision. The West Slope responders seize an opportunity in the Wormhewers' advance. Encouraged by Muradin, they smash forward into the flanks of the Revenants, hoping, if nothing else, to buy time with their lives. Rigor Mortix moves to meet them. The Dwarves Attack crumples one of the Revenants before Rigor Mortix arrives and lays about him with his mace. Wide sweeps the weapon send dwarves flying to land broken on the ground, and 3 are killed in the champion's retaliation. Finding himself suddenly alone, surrounded by enemies, and worst of all, in the woods, the final West Slope responder is forced back, panic beginning to overtake him. The Darkmoor wolves ready themselves to pounce upon the Stoney Creek Watch, but a strange smell, or a loud noise, or something, who knows with these wolves, has them whining at the edge of the copse. Taking advantage of the wolves' reluctance, the Stoney Creek Watch loose an accurate storm of arrows at the Crimson Stalkers. 3 hits is enough to kill one of the abominations with their undead rule. As soon as the arrows leave their strings, the Watch draw swords and axes and fall upon the startled Darkmoor wolves. Fight 0 +1 for a rank still results in 2 of the wolves being struck down. The Dwarves Attack so swift, the startled wolves fail to retaliate. Unsurprisingly, the wolf begins to panic. Autocratics manages to snatch together a handful of loose threads and channel the magic into the blades of the Wickerwood soldiers, which begin to drip thick black ichor. Bronra also feels the shift in the weave. She binds the strands with traced runes and causes the skin of the West Slope militia to harden like stone. The Wormreach spears pivot, then slog through the woods to finish the last West Slope responder. Spears lash out, piercing flesh, and the last responder's sword falls from limp fingers before he can strike back. Under the stern watch of Murdered in Golden Rock, West Slope Militia activate and wheel before charging the Wickerwood soldiers.
Get stuck in, lads!
Mattocks and hammers strike with the strength to splinter stone, and 4 skeletons are shattered before them. The unarmoured dwarves prove easy victims for the Wickerwood champion and his soldiers, in spite of their hardened skin, and 3 of the militia fall. Their uncaring nature results in the further skeleton being smashed by a wild swing, and a 4th dwarf succumbs to the weeping blades of the dead. The horrors before them are too much for the dwarf militia, and even with Murden shouting encouragement, their morale begins to waver as they inch back from the skeleton lines. Moxis binds the strengthening weave and raises one of the fallen skeleton soldiers back to its feet. The West Slope archers send another volley towards their closest target, the worm-reach spears in the woods. Arrows punch through the thin canopy, and struck twice, a single skeleton falls. Gangrenous Hex fails to activate, the weave parting around him, and simply pivots slightly. Murdered in Golden Rock and his guard activate. Thinking better of charging into the still very deadly worm hewers, he and his guard move up in position to block their advance. The Crimson Stalkers, seeking to circumvent the West Slope spears, wheel and move towards the much squishier Stoney Creek watch. Finally, the West Slope spears, unsure whether to chase the ghouls, decide to wheel out of the woods and threaten the main undead flank. At the end of turn 5, the dwarves are barely holding on, but they are still holding on nevertheless. If they can continue to endure, they can still win this. The undead must still punch through their lines in advance, and they are beginning to run out of time.
Suffer not those who draw breath.
Initiative on turn 6 goes to the undead with a 9. The Wickerwood champion seizes the opportunity to break open the dwarven line and charges his soldiers into the disordered West Slope militia.
Here they come again.
While his soldiers keep the dwarves occupied, the champion cleaves dwarves with his mighty blade, cutting 2 down in a single stroke. Wavering but not out, the dwarves counter with their heavy weapons, smashing 3 skeletons to pieces. The militia remain determined to make a good accounting of themselves and hold their ground, driving the Wickerwood soldiers back.
That's it. Off you go.
Aware the ghouls have almost broken through, the Stoney Creek watch activate and loose a point-blank volley into the approaching creatures. 3 of the arrows strike true, and another ghoul falls. Once again the dwarves draw sword and axe and rush the approaching undead. Their melee weapons prove more deadly than their arrows, and they cut down 2 of the slavering monstrosities. The ghouls are among them now though, and nightmarish claws and teeth seek out vulnerable spots on the unarmoured dwarves. 2 of the border guard fall screaming as the ghouls drag them back through their lines. A further ghoul is struck down as he's dragging a victim away, but the watch begin to waver as the remaining ghouls begin to feed on their still living prey. Rigor Mortis and the worm hewers rush the thin dwarf line, axes and mace ready to strike. The dwarves hunker behind their shields, determined to hold. The revenants hook shields aside or drive through them with brute force. 2 dwarves fall to their onslaught. In an admirable show, the dwarves manage to dispatch 2 of the attacking revenants, their axes caught in the dwarves' comrades. Overwhelmed by sheer numbers, Murden and his last remaining guard begin to lose their nerve, but still prevent the undead from advancing. The situation is becoming desperate for the dwarves, and the West Slope spears move to bolster the line. They push into the flank of the Wickerwood soldiers, spears concentrated to punch through. The Wickerwood champion moves to hold them back. The dwarves' rush crumples into the undead flank, 3 being ground beneath their hobnailed boots, and their spears and shields batter the Wickerwood champion, giving him no room to swing his sword. The dwarves' powerful charge catches one more skeleton as they drive the skeletal soldiers before them, forcing the worm hewers to scramble back out of the way they should have the first time. Moxis surveys the shifting battle before him and spots an opportunity to break the dwarven line wide open. Chanting ancient words, he launches another fireball, this time at the disordered Westslope militia. The spell bursts within the dwarven ranks, throwing dwarves off their feet. All but one rise again, their hardened skin protecting them from the blast. But the combination of magical and exanimate assault proves too much for the ordinary foe of the Westslope, and as they scramble back to their feet, they turn and flee the battlefield. The Westslope spears watch them go, but remain steadfast themselves.
You're not afraid of a couple of wee skeletons, are you, lads?
And as their flank disappears, the Westslope guard remain doggedly in place.
I've a job to do, and by Ruckus's beard, I'll stand here and see it done.
The Westslope archers send another volley into the woods, their closest target once again being the worm-reach spears. However, distracted by the fleeing militia, their aim is poor and their arrows are swallowed by the trees. The worm-reach spears then advance through the copse, pushing around the dwarven lines, before wheeling to encircle Myrddin and the remaining Westslope guards dwarf. Bronwyn the Crone notes the valour of the Westslope spears, and once more binding the weave with runecraft, causes the spear dwarf's skin to harden. The remaining Darkmoor wolf continues to whine piteously on the flank of the battlefield and shuffles around hesitantly. Autocratic seeks to enchant the blade of the Wormhewers yet again, but fails to grasp the weave of magic. Gangrenous Hex activates and attempts to cast Reanimate on the Wormreach spears in the distance. However, he just repeats Autocratic's disappointing performance. At the end of turn 6, a massive hole has been blown in the dwarves' line, but the undead forces are also starting to look very tattered, and they are quickly running out of time and scoring units.
That's it, Westslope spears. We've got 'em right where we want 'em.
Initiative on turn 7 goes to the dwarves for some reason, though very clearly it should have gone to the undead. The Westslope spears wheel, then charge into the flank of the Wormhewers. Rigor Mortis moving to meet them.
Get stuck in, lads.
The weight of their charge crushes the flank of the Wormhewers. 6 Revenants being run through and trampled.
More Grims are off.
Caught up in the dwarf tide, Rigor Mortis lays about him with his two-handed mace, cracking helm and limb and laying out 3 of the heavily armoured dwarves. Under his vicious attack, the dwarves begin to panic, even as the momentum of their charge crushes 3 further Revenant linebreakers. Ooh, 9 casualties. When the undead begin to fall, they fall hard. The Westslope spears drive the remaining Revenants before them. Shocked by the destruction of the Revenants, Moxis' will wavers and the Wickerwood soldiers fail to activate, shuffling forward towards the Westslope guard. Heartened by the valour of the Westslope spears, Myrddin Goldenrock rallies his last guardsman and wheels backwards to face a threat of the Wormreach spears on his flank. The Crimson Stalkers are engrossed with feeding on the fallen border guard and fail to activate, merely shuffling around a bit. Bronwyn the Crone binds the weave into a fireball to weaken the Wormreach spears, but the magical strands slip away and the attempt fails. Recovering from the shock, Moxis sends the Wormreach spear to slaughter Myrddin Goldenrock and finally finish the dwarf line. The dwarves raise their shields to defend, and Myrddin himself steps forward to fight alone, just hoping to endure.
Let me handle this, lad.
With an unassailable defence of 12, Myrddin breaks the skeletal charge and swings back with his mace of office. His blow glances off a bronze shield, and both sides back away from each other. The Westslope archers loose another volley down on the Wormreach spears, better late than never, and without the cover of the trees land 3 strikes on the skeletons, dropping a single model. Moxis, enraged at the victory of the speared dwarves, summons a fireball to explode within their disordered ranks. The spell detonates, but the shields and hardened skin of the dwarves baffle the impact, and the spell has no effect. The Stoney Creek watch, still horrified by the sight before them, loose a tattered volley at the feeding ghouls. 2 arrows strike true, dropping a single ghoul, but perhaps more importantly, removing the ghoul's ability to score. With only undead units left, the Darkmoor Wolf remains whining on the edge of the battle. Gangrenous Hex utters words of dark power, and one of the fallen Wickerwood soldiers rises back into place. Autocratix pivots on the spot, and only able to see the one target, he enchants the blades of the remaining Wormhewers, which begin to drip once more. At the end of turn 7, what was looking like a commanding lead to the undead has evaporated under the flank assault of the West Slope Spears and terrible performance of the skeletons and ghouls. With only 1 turn and 2 scoring units remaining, the undead have to get both skeleton units within 12 inches of the dwarves' table edge next turn. Not going to happen. So the undead will be forced to withdraw, and the victory will go to the dwarves.
Damnable dwarves, ever where they are most unwanted. Curse them. There's nothing for it now. I'll have to pull back to the ford and bring the rest up, lest I waste more corpses. Blast them. Well done, lads. That'll about do it. They're pulling back. Yeah! Quickly, gather the wounded and let's get back to camp. The king himself will toast to the valor of West Slope.
Yes! Victory!
A couple of units lost quite a few models, so let's do a roll for those. The Darkmoor Wolves get a 3 + 1, resulting in heavy casualties. Another 3 for the Shadow Pelt, also heavy casualties. And for the Wormhewers, 6 + 2 results in light casualties, so thankfully they will be ready for the next game. I suppose a bit of roll for how long the Wolves are away for too, so using a D3, the Darkmoor are away for 3 games, and the Shadow Pelt just the 1. Well, things were going well until they weren't. A couple of poor plays on Mox's behalf, combined with inopportune failures to activate, meant the dwarves punished the undead. Despite suffering heavy losses, they just would not budge. The stubbornness of dwarves, huh? But this setback will not be the end of Moxis. It's only going to make him hunger for revenge even more. Apologies for the black dice. I realise now they are very difficult to see on camera despite being very obvious in real life. So I'll have to work on the lighting for those for next time. But nevertheless, I do hope that you enjoyed this episode. Let me know what you thought of it down in the comments below, and we shall see you all next time. Cheers!